Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grays Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be looking at what if Richard Nixon beat JFK in the 1960 presidential election. That election, for those who don't know, was very, very tight. It was one of the closest in US history. Kennedy only won it because of two states, and the gap between Richard Nixon and JFK in those two states totals about 55,000 votes. And these were the two states of Illinois and Texas. Kennedy's running mate, LBJ, who obviously became the president after JFK in our time, in like the actual timeline, he was from the state of Texas, and he was very influential in that state. And then on top of that, you had Illinois, which is obviously Chicago, right? The Democratic Party in many cities around the country were notorious for having what's known as machines, right? Very powerful, influential people, some of them political, some of them actually criminal, who would basically, at a time of elections, they would really push for whatever candidate they wanted to be actually elected and stuff. It seems pretty obvious, and also as well, if you watch the film The Irishman, kind of really, really good Scorsese film, it's out on Netflix, I believe, so definitely check that out. It seems that in the state of Illinois, there was about 8,000 or 9,000 votes, and even at the time, it seemed pretty clear that the election was stolen. However, when we compare 1960 to 2020, like if you look at my previous video, the video on what if there was a civil war in America, definitely check that out. And also note the like-dislike ratio. So at the moment, I think it's like 5 likes to 3 dislikes, and the comment section is quite lively. And it's because I try to take a very non-partisan view, kind of on the election. Just try to say actually the process of electing the president is more important than who becomes the president, and that's obviously what the founding fathers wanted when they set things up. As George Washington said, a house divided cannot stand, and America has a very important role to play in the world, and the last thing that it needs is to tear itself apart over an election, because you want there to continually be elections. You don't want to crash the whole system because of one election. How did Richard Nixon, Tricky Dicky, as like that, future Watergate guy, right? How did he respond? This is one of the most, he's notorious for, even his own senators and congressmen said that he's the most dishonest man that that they've ever come across. How did he respond to this? I'm going to read out his speech. I could think of no worse example for nations abroad who for the first time were trying to put free electoral procedures into effect than that of the United States wrangling over the results of our presidential election, and even suggesting that the presidency itself could be stolen by thievery at the ballot box. So, even Tricky Dicky, even he was like, you know what, the eyes of the world are on America, and as much as I would like to be president, as much as my supporters would like me to be president, as much as it might be clear that this was a stolen election, actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's much more important that we keep the ball rolling, that we keep the system ticking over, because there's no sense in America crashing it itself. And that's why most people don't know about the 1960 US presidential election, because Nixon didn't make it a big thing. Even though you had many Republican congressmen and senators, notably Barry Goldwater, who later ran in the 1964 election against LBJ. Even though these people were saying it's a stolen election, we need to rerun it again, we need to and they contested it in all the different states and stuff. Nixon recognized that actually, in the context of America and the Cold War and America's obligation to its allies and to people around the world who look to America as a beacon for freedom and democracy, if you were distant in the Soviet Union, or in one of the Warsaw Pact countries, behind the Iron Curtain, or if you were in China, if you were in any of these newly independent countries that Richard Nixon was talking about, who upon becoming independent, they had two choices. They could either go to the Soviet Union, and communism, or they could go towards capitalism and democracy with the United States. And to have the United States in 1960 have torn itself apart because of just one election, that would have been really devastating for America's stand in the world and for the continued advancement and the prosperity of freedom around the world. Just wanted to make that point there. It's kind of, again, that shouldn't be a partisan point. I'm not going to say like who I kind of supported in the 2020 like kind of election, but let's just say regardless of what side won, I am anti-mob. I'm pro law and order. I'm pro like democratic procedures, and if the democratic procedures like there are irregularities, you go through the legal procedures, you go through like for the courts, and if the courts rule it out, as much as you might not like it, that's it. You don't start a revolution, you don't start like a civil war, you chill out and you go, right, next time we're going to fight this thing, we're going to fight it better. Something to note as well, this election was close, but it wasn't as, like, it was closer than it was expected, but it's a thing of, the 1961 was much closer than this one. If you were going to make an argument about voter fraud and stuff, yeah, and about swinging election, there's much stronger case for the 1960 election than there was in the 2020 election. So just saying that, hopefully the like-dislike ratio is probably going to go a bit off, but whatever, I just wanted to get that out of the way because I think that's something that people really need to scale back a bit and recognise. Before we go any further, that's something they just need to recognise. Now, how would this have affected how America conducted itself during the Cold War? So for a little bit of context, obviously America was fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. It was capitalism versus communism. It was freedom and democracy versus totalitarianism. And so what things were happening in 1960, 1960 like to let's say 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated, what things were happening in that world? You had the arms race, which, the United States was way ahead. They had far more nuclear weapons than the Soviets did. However, this idea of there being a missile gap was something which had been played up by the Democrats, right? So before 1960, you'd had 8 years of the Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and you had Richard Nixon as his vice president. And in that time, they had focused on containment of communism around the world, so that new countries didn't become communist. They weren't in favor of like all-out kind of wars as such. They were more in favor of like having a strong policy, but also like a very surgical kind of policy of like, let's get in and out and just deal with this little crisis, right? As a result of that, they built up the US military, they built up the nuclear arsenal, yeah? This idea of a missile gap, yeah, in terms of the Soviets being able to close this missile gap, it was largely a myth which JFK and others in the Democrats really tried to play up. The idea was that if they could make people be scared of this thing of like, oh, the Soviets are catching up, they're going to overtake us, yeah? It would make the Republican administration look weaker, and that they'd drop the ball, and therefore the Democrats could come in. So JFK throughout the thing routinely was going on about this missile gap, and as soon as he got into office, he was like, oh yeah, clearly there isn't actually this missile gap. So yeah. Anyway, there were many other things that were happening in the late 50s, early 60s, which impacted America. So we're going to get into that in the course of this video. First things first, we need to look at what happened in Cuba. So 1959, you had the Batista regime, which was supported by the United States, and it was overthrown in a revolution by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and there were suspicions at that time as to whether Cuba was going to go communist or not, because the Eisenhower administration recognized that while Castro at that point hadn't come out as a communist, there were many people in his little band and stuff, yeah, who were out and out communists, and so he had a lot of suspicions about this, yeah? And then the fact that Castro later came in and nationalized all the predominantly American-owned industries, that really started to get on the administration's nerves, and it started having closer and closer ties to the Soviet Union. As a result of this, there was a plan put together by the CIA. The Bay of Pigs had been something that had been set up by the CIA, where you had a group of, I believe, 15,000 Cuban exiles who had fled to Miami after the fall of the Batista regime. And the idea was that they would land on the south side of Cuba, a few miles away from Havana, and they would overthrow when they landed, the people would rise up against Castro and his communist people, but there would basically be a counter-revolution as such. And the reason why this didn't work is because no one had briefed Kennedy on this when he became president, and so the plans had already been put in place, and so when he just kind of was like, well, okay, they can go ahead, but we're not going to send in the US Air Force to back it up. And as a result, these Cuban exiles were stuck on the speech, and they were bombed to bits, and many of them were captured, and it was a huge humiliation. And the Kennedy administration didn't understand at the time the consequences of this being a failure. They didn't understand the consequences of the Air Force not being there and supporting them, and how it would make their administration look weak against communism. What we have to ask ourselves is, if Kennedy hadn't become the president and Nixon had become the president, what would Richard Nixon have done? What I was watching just before making this video, yeah, because I've seen it many years ago, yeah, but I had to just watch it again just as a kind of like as just a comparison. So we've all seen the debates that took place in 2016, in 2020, and all the kind of recent years. Go on YouTube now, or after you watch this video, of course. There'll be a link in the bio here, like kind of if I remember correctly. But check out the debates between Richard Nixon and JFK. Watch how civil the thing is. Watch how both men kind of go, they respectfully disagree with the other. Look about how what they're debating about is actually about the issues at hand. It's not talking about you are this and you're that and he's, you know, it's not about that. It's focusing on the issues that the American people actually care about. It's very civil. It's very civilized. This is what statesmen look like, yeah. And I don't think on either side of the 2020 election you've seen that. I don't think on any side of the 2016 elections you saw this. Many elections you've seen people, as it were, play the man and not the ball. When we really contrast this, yeah, we have to recognise that Nixon, he wanted policies which, you know, he basically wanted to continue the Eisenhower administration's policies. Yeah, he wanted continued prosperity. The Eisenhower administration, it was one in which the American dream like really took off. Like it was a time where economic growth was huge. Wages for ordinary people like grew and grew. The gap between rich and poor like continued to go down. Things were getting better for the average American. You had civil rights legislation being passed. The whole country was moving steadily but surely in the right direction. Yeah, in a positive kind of direction. More and more people were being supported. You had many poor people in America, and you know, the poverty rate continue to decline as more people got more affluent middle class jobs and moved out to the suburbs. A lot of things were happening in the 50s that were really good, and we look back at the 50s as a time when America was, you know, when we think about American culture, we tend to think back very nostalgically to the 50s. The 1960s could have very much been an extension of that, but if you'd had the Republicans in, you might not have necessarily had the huge divisions that we had. The Democratic Party was very divided on issues to do with Vietnam and on issues to do with race and on several other issues, but these are the two kind of main defining ones that happened in the 60s. So on civil rights, you had Northern Democrats, yeah, like kind of like who tended to be a lot more liberal and much more in favour of civil rights legislation, and then you had the Dixiecrats, who were Southern Democrats, who were very conservative and were opposed to civil rights legislation. So the Democratic Party was divided on that issue. And oftentimes a lot of the legislation, if you look at the legislation that was passed, yeah, like whether it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many other things, the Republican Party tended to be more on the side of civil rights than the Democratic Party. And this contrasts really greatly with what we see in the present day. So in the present day, the parties themselves tend to be drawn along ideological lines, where you have all the Republicans voting one way and you have all the Democrats voting another way, and therefore it really matters which party wins that election. Whereas in those days, you know, the norm for most of American history has been a thing where the party system has been relatively weak. So actually there were quite a lot of like kind of cross-party collaborations that people had, and most of the legislation that was passed in those times, although you had a Democrat majority like kind of in the House and Senate, in particular in the House, still didn't mean that legislation couldn't get through. It still didn't mean that people couldn't pass things, yeah, because the Republicans would work with the Democrats and the Democrats work with the Republicans. It was much more based on like the individual statesmen, yeah, and like how they decided to vote on an issue rather than it being one camp versus another. So while the Democrats were split on the issue of, for instance, civil rights, the Republicans were relatively unified. However, the Democrats who were pro-civil rights were more fervently for civil rights. They wanted it much quicker and they wanted the federal government to play a much more active role in that. The Republicans, by contrast, were opposed to Jim Crow. They were opposed to the racial segregation. They wanted desegregation in school. They wanted desegregation in the schools. They wanted desegregation across the board, yeah. But they wanted it to be done on a state-by-state basis. This is where kind of the issue of states' rights starts to really kind of become an issue again in America, because the pro-civil rights Democrats in the North are not interested in the states' rights. They want the federal government to come in and say, no, actually, we're passing this legislation at a federal level that prohibits segregation and forces like integration and forces busing. So really trying to really stamp out racism in that sense. But they were opposed by Democrats in the South who would filibuster, who would stonewall, who would really do everything that they can to make sure that legislation didn't pass. If you'd had a Republican presidency throughout the early 60s, you might have seen perhaps a slower civil rights thing, a more muted civil rights movement, but it would have been a much less contentious one, because it would have been a thing where Richard Nixon focused a lot more on the states, on going through the states and on getting the states to approve it and stuff, rather than it being the federal government kind of imposing on it. So whether that's right or wrong, that's just the situation. That's what they wanted. The second thing that was divisive within the 1960s was the issue of Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, I will just posit that it might have gone differently. Not guaranteed, but it might have gone differently if you'd had Richard Nixon being the president, instead of JFK and LBJ. Now, what I mean by that is this: JFK was the first president that got America really involved in Vietnam. He sent up to 16,000 military advisors into there. And then LBJ, he ended up becoming president because of the assassination of JFK. And then obviously he was then re-elected, he was then elected in 1964 with a stonking majority, in large part to do with President Kennedy's assassination just a year before. So it was seen as kind of almost bad faith to vote the other way. Now, with both of these presidents, America's policy in Vietnam was one of massive escalation, massive troop involvement. Militarily, the United States won in Vietnam, but politically they lost it. And the reason for that is mainly because you had a handful of people in Washington that they thought that they were very clever, like Ivy League people and stuff, yeah, and they didn't understand how to wage a war. Now, what I mean by that is this: they didn't understand that there's no sense in putting almost 500,000 US personnel in South Vietnam and fighting in South Vietnam when you have the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where communist North Vietnam is able to send multiple troops and supplies and everything through Laos, through Cambodia, and into the south. So the fact that they didn't secure this, the fact they didn't put a chokehold there in Laos, that meant that they were able to come through. So we can see this because Richard Nixon, he became president in 1968, and so he was, he presided over kind of the last few years of the Vietnam War, and his focus was on Vietnamization. His focus was on more surgical things or on more tactical things. So, for instance, you see the invasion of Cambodia. Again, that was partly to do with trying to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the situation by 1970, it had become untenable. Politically, Vietnam had become a very toxic and very divisive war that Americans wanted to get out of as soon as possible. And so when, for instance, Nixon authorized the invasion of Cambodia, again, militarily it was a success. They managed to capture many Viet Cong and NVA positions in Cambodia. But then politically, they then had to withdraw from Cambodia very soon afterwards. Now, there had been a proposal all the way back in the Eisenhower administration that what should have happened is that Laos should have been invaded by the US, and this was something which Eisenhower increasingly pushed and wanted Nixon to kind of do. And strategically speaking, this would have made sense because, as Eisenhower said, it's the bottleneck here. All the supplies coming through from North to South Vietnam has to pass from Laos, and so if you're able to take out Laos and keep control over Laos, then there would be no Ho Chi Minh Trail. If that was the case, it would be very very hard for all the guerrilla campaigns, for all for the Tet Offensive, for many things that happened in the subsequent years to have happened if the Americans had been able to hold on to Laos, keep the borders there secure, and to ensure that there was no Ho Chi Minh Trail. So in terms of winning the Vietnam War, strategically speaking, whether that war was right or wrong, strategically speaking, America, the only way it could have won it is by choking off the Ho Chi Minh Trail and ensuring that you didn't have this constant stream of men and supplies. If this had been listened to, perhaps if Nixon had been made president, perhaps he would have actually acted upon this. And if this had been enacted in a coordinated way, in a proper way, that in an effective way, I think that actually much of what we saw with the later Vietnam War and the high casualty rates and the destruction of much of South Vietnam, I don't think that would have needed to have happened. And I think that the North would have been much better contained had this kind of policy been enacted. So then obviously we can think of all the ramifications of the effect that the Vietnam War had on the world, that that had on America, the peace movement, much of the kind of civil unrest, much of the kind of dissidents, the lack of deference that subsequent generations have had, the lack of faith in institutions. The Vietnam War shook America to its core and really made it question what it meant to be an American and what America's place in the world was. And I think if that war had somehow been averted through these means in a hypothetical way, I think that history would have been very different. Whether it be better or worse, that's up for debate, but I think it certainly would have been different. And then also with regard to what happened in Cuba. Now with the Bay of Pigs, the fact that Kennedy did not support these troops meant that what ended up happening is that Castro ended up going even more into the Soviet camp and ended up getting weapons and ended up getting money from the Soviets, and ultimately he ended up getting nuclear missile. And this led straight to the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later, in 1962, in which obviously Kennedy ended up having to play what's known as brinkmanship with the Soviet Union. So the idea of, it's basically like the game of chicken, yeah? You got two cars and you're driving at each other, and the first one that swerves out the way ends up being the chicken. In that kind of high stake game, it's a thing of the weaker side will be the one that swerves out the way. However, if both sides fancy themselves to be hardmen, then it ends up being a thing where both sides end up colliding, and that's what was the Cuban Missile Crisis could easily have been. It could have been actual real life nuclear war, right? If Nixon had been the president in that time, first of all, under Eisenhower administration, you had what's known as the Thaw, which was a kind of a thawing in the tensions within the Cold War, so a relaxation of tensions. Now, some of that thaw was starting to kind of break down in 1960s and stuff, with the U-2 spy planes getting shot down, and with a few other kind of incidents like that. But by and large, is a thing of the aim of the Republican Party was to contain communism, but to keep generally good relationships with the Soviet Union as such. They didn't want a direct kind of war with the Soviet Union. They just wanted to make sure that all these proxy wars that the free world kind of had control over. If Castro had been overthrown in the Bay of Pigs, certainly Cuban missiles wouldn't have been based there. Maybe there might have been some other incidents within the Cold War. At least we can be assured that there would be no Soviet missiles in a capitalist Cuba. And obviously all the ramifications of that, how this kind of end up leading to detente. But at the same time, it was a thing where Richard Nixon, when he was president, he really pushed for detente far more than LBJ did, and far more than JFK did. So again, you might have had a much more relaxed Cold War if you'd had Nixon being the president during those years, rather than JFK and LBJ later. So now the next thing we're going to talk about is the so-called war on poverty. Yeah, so this was something that LBJ ended up pushing, and as we've mentioned, if JFK didn't win the presidency, would LBJ necessarily have become the president after him? It's highly debatable. So if that hadn't happened, what would have been the effects societally? That's where we have to look at what the war on poverty was, and what its goals were, and to what extent it achieved these goals. Now, as with any kind of thing, there's obviously two sides to the argument. The war on poverty was basically a massive kind of government program to help people in disadvantaged communities around America, in particular black communities, in the ghettos, and also there was many like rural white communities, such as like in Appalachia, who were supported as well. Now, for a lot of money that was spent on this war on poverty, it did reduce poverty. At the same time, if we look at the statistics, the poverty rate amongst Americans had continued to decline quite rapidly over the preceding years. Did the war on poverty drastically reduce it, or was it just continuing the trend of like reducing poverty in America just through like free market like kind of enterprise? That's something which economists and politicians have debated for many years, so take with that what you will, because what the Republicans were more in favor of was state governments focused on these sort of things, on private enterprise, on charity focused on these things. But the Democrats obviously wanted a much like stronger federal government with regard to this. So again, would there have been a war on poverty? Probably not to the same extent as we might have imagined. But as we've mentioned already, the Democrats did have control over the House of Congress at that time, and so it's a thing of as much as a Republican president might have wanted to block certain policies, I think that in that time when there was general consensus about things, that you didn't have this huge ideological gap. I don't really see how there would have been a major difference if Kennedy and LBJ hadn't become president. I think a lot of the things which they've been credited for, I think would have continued anyway, maybe at a slower rate, but yeah, it would have continued anyway. You know what else you need to do? You need to hit that like button. Now I'm going to bring in my old friend JFK to speak on this. We choose to hit the like button, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. We must log into YouTube, we must set up an account if we haven't already, and whoever our friends are, whoever our foes, I can't remember the exact quote, that's embarrassing. Anyway, basically, we're gonna hit that like button whether it's easy to do or hard to do. So yeah, so basically hit the like button because that really helps the algorithm. It means that more new people end up watching these videos, and I know that a lot of people obviously enjoy these things. As controversial as some of the videos end up being, yeah, if we could really hit the 20 likes target, that would be really appreciated. So anyway, back to the rest of the video. So just to conclude, what would have been different in America? Within America itself, much of the progress that took place in the 1950s would have continued on in the 1960s, albeit slightly slower. Would you have necessarily had Democrats being elected in 64 or in 68? I don't know. Like, it's quite difficult to kind of say. As we've mentioned in our previous video, the end of history, talk about the kind of like pendulum effect, like throughout history. From 1932 to 1952, you had Democratic presidencies. From 1952 to 1960s, you had Republican. From 1960 to 68, you had Democrats, etc., etc. So there's kind of a cycle where it's like you have the Democrats in for a few cycles, and then you had the Republicans in. If you end up having Richard Nixon being made president in 1960, you would have then had at least 12 years of a Republican in the White House, right? So what's to say that in 1964, people might have got a bit sick of the Republicans and thought, we want a Democrat in now. What's to say in 1968, instead of like, because obviously Nixon wouldn't have been able to run in 68. So who would have run for the Democrats and who would have run for the Republicans in 68? Like, who knows? Like, so in that sense, quite a lot of things are up in the air. But I think that generally speaking, the Cold War and the 60s in general would have been much less contentious. I think you would have had quite a moderating effect. Yeah, so I think that this election had a very pivotal moment in US history. I think that for all the things that happened in the 1960s, as divisive as that period were, I think it would have been far more divisive if the issue of who became president in that year had been made a bigger issue than it was. I think that if Nixon had acted like certain people are acting now, I think that it would have really damaged America's place in the world, and it would have really damaged their chances of winning the Cold War. So, on that note, have a good day and bye. Oh, and also stay tuned for the next video, which is going to be on what would have happened if the Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened. So that's in 1803. So again, it might seem a little bit far off, but the implications of that were huge. It almost doubled like the size of America, and we have to think geopolitically, domestically, etc. if this purchase had never happened, because it almost didn't happen. So definitely stay tuned for that, and in the meantime, bye.